China could have. Perhaps it's testing the responses for a future bioweapon that would be more severe. But I don't think that the evidence in the virus itself shows that it was man-made. For example, if you look at the DNA sequencing of the virus, we can see that there is a high homology with a bat coronavirus. And then on the protein receptors, what binds with the cells in the host, we see that that part of the virus has a high homology with a pangolin. And the success rate of that binding is so high that it actually beat out what people would assume a bioweapon would be, which one might think that is a reason for it being a bioweapon. But because it's so successful, it seems to point to it being something that came from natural selection rather than it being created in a laboratory. So my position is that this virus arised of natural origins, that it's a recombinant, meaning that it was a combination of this bat virus and this pangolin virus, and then it jumped to humans. And it could have jumped to humans a long time ago. It could have been in humanity for decades, and we didn't know because it hadn't evolved to sufficiently spread as rapidly as it has. It could have jumped this year, months ago. So I think that it came of natural origins through natural selection. And I absolutely grant that China is probably making bioweapons and has intentions to unleash a bioweapon possibly in the future, but I don't think that this virus fits that case.
When you talked about bondings from bats and all, I want to add that there are three major features that are present in all SARS and MERS and SARS-CoV-2. The spike proteins, the membrane proteins, and the envelope proteins. Now, where my suggestion came that it was a bioweapon, first of all, there's only one level 4 medical handling facility in China, which is based, surprisingly, in Wuhan. In Wuhan, they only have one level 4 facility, which is in charge of taking care of all viruses that have spread, including Ebola, further development of the measles. So they're trying to find vaccines and trying to find solutions day by day. Now, where my factor comes in is that over the last 4 to 5 months, a lot of employees have started departing from the workplace of this level 4 facility, where one of the employees reported that one of the fellow employees within the firm left with one of the samples of MERS, but never returned with it, saying that he went for additional investigation and reportedly went to the US, but has not been seen for the last few months. And when they looked into it as a department, they found out that there were changes made to the membrane proteins so that it would transmit in micro air particles, hence becoming what it is today as SARS-CoV-2, one of the worst spreads in its family.
Yeah, I've heard that theory too. I've heard that called the spy theory, that perhaps there were Western spies working in the level 4 biolab, and they came back to the States. And they were working on MERS, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So MERS is a very, very deadly version of this virus. I think it had one of the highest death rates out of all of them. SARS-CoV-2, I think, is around 1 to 2%, depending. I think it's probably more likely to be around 1%. SARS, the original, I believe, was much higher. If I recall correctly, it was somewhere around 3 or 4%. But then MERS was around 8%. So I think as a bioweapon, if MERS were to have the aerosol capability, it would be a much more effective weapon. So I think that there is probably strong evidence in that case that they were trying to weaponize MERS. But again, I don't see how that weaponization of MERS created SARS-CoV-2.
So, and then to add on to my protein bonding research, spike proteins and envelope protein filled viruses always are spread across animals such as rats, birds, and major types of bats as well. So my first analysis comes from major World Health Organization points of view, where they say, I'm quoting it from the write-up, analysis of the SARS-CoV-2 genome indicate a single spillover event, meaning the virus jumped only once from an animal to a person, is unlikely, as it would take decades and decades of generation development whilst being detected in human beings before it's concluded that it was circulated. So one spillover event cannot lead to such a big disease to be widespread.
Yeah,
Hence,
I agree with you that it's not one spillover event. I'm curious, do you have that study on hand? Do you mind linking it in debate chat?
I just copied the write-up from the text. I could.
Oh, okay. I agree with you that it wasn't just like one jump across into humanity. I think that the virus, if it jumped into humans and has been in humans for a long time, that it wasn't very infectious, and so it might have infected a human and then mutated inside the human body. But when that virus was cured, it didn't jump to another human. It might have jumped back to another animal that the human was working with. There's also the possibility of it not evolving in humans at all, that it evolved in an animal agriculture situation where there were bats in one room with pangolins. And in that location, the virus evolved in both of those animals, jumping back and forth because they were in close proximity. And then eventually, after the virus had mutated in that natural setting, it jumped to humans using these animals as a reservoir for the virus. So I'm not saying that it absolutely evolved inside of humanity. It's a possibility, but I think that I agree with you that it wasn't a single spillover event. I think that that could still mean that it was evolving in the natural setting of the animal agriculture. Not that the animal agriculture is a natural setting, but that the bodies that the virus was in and jumping across would be natural to the virus rather than being made in a lab.
Then, in addition to when you're saying pangolins having the coronavirus, yes?
Well, the pangolins have a type of coronavirus, but where it's really similar to this virus is the protein binding that it has. So it's the ACE2 protein. And that protein is really, really good at bonding the virus to human cells. And the pangolin version of the coronavirus that they sequenced has a very high match to the human, the one that's infecting humans right now. It's something like 94% the same DNA sequence. So there's only a slight change that had to happen in order for that protein binding to jump to humans, or to be as good as it is at infecting humans. Sorry, it was already good at infecting humans. It only had to make a slight change to become the virus that we're sequencing now from humans. And the other part of the virus, the inside of the virus, has a lot higher similarity to the bat coronavirus. And so they think that what happened is those two viruses combined together. So I guess the question then is, from my perspective, I think that those viruses recombined in an animal agriculture setting, or possibly they recombined in nature, but I think that's a little less likely just because the pangolins are brought from Southern Asia into China rather than existing in the same environment as the bats. Although bats, they live everywhere and they migrate long distances. So there is also the natural possibility that they were living inside of nature. But because this virus was brought to a highly densely populated area, I think that it's more likely it came through animal agriculture.
To add on to my earlier fact about jumping directly as one spillover event,
Yeah.
there are numerous possibilities that people say that it could have transferred. But where I'm coming to with this point as it being planned, why was it that the earlier versions of COVID-19 were not taken into the level 4 facility? And why was there a discharge of the same type of weak, wonderful, forced virus that was spread outside? Rather than it being contained, why was it let go within 2 to 3 weeks of detection in November?
That's a good question. So just so I get the timeline correct.
And let me add on to that something.
Yeah, sure.
The 6 to 7 most spots where we have level 4 facilities, those would be, let me give you the exact places. There's 6 more. There's one in Atlanta in the US, Frederick, Galveston, Hamilton, and San Antonio, right? They're all based in the US. There's one in Canada that's in progress.
Okay.
So
the Fredericks one in the U.S., do you know what state that is?
It's MD. It says MD here.
Okay.
Yeah.
So there are 6 to 7 in the world, and one's in China. The majority of the rest are in the United States, and one is being built in Canada. Is that correct? Okay, so back to your...
The Frederick one is in Maryland.
Oh, Maryland. Okay, cool.
The one... Yeah.
Cool. All right, so the big question that you asked was about when the virus came about in China. Like, why didn't China...
why didn't China decontain? Because immediately COVID-19 was reported, the 56th case of DNA samples were immediately ejected and put into the level 4 facility for research. And it's currently being worked on through ACDC medication.
So you think that China knew about the virus earlier than they said? I agree with that. I think that that China, the officials in China, probably knew that they had a novel virus on their hands. I'm not sure exactly why they didn't share the information that they had a novel coronavirus. As far as I remember, it seemed like there were social media posts about this new virus coming out before the official government came out with it. I think that you could say that it's possible China didn't talk about this virus because they didn't want there to be any kind of bad press. I think China does a lot of work to make sure that their image looks really good around the world. And they already have a history of these viruses popping up in their country. And they didn't handle the first SARS outbreak very well. They received a lot of criticism. And because of that, I think they're very, very cautious about what type of criticism they would receive. So as soon as these cases came out to the public via the news, then they locked down really, really severely and totally changed the narrative. Like the WHO came out and said that they were doing a great job. So I guess I could see a possibility of the reason why China didn't come out with this information totally had to do with what they thought would strategically help their image in the media. But you're saying, if I'm getting this correct, you're saying that the reason why they didn't come out with it is because they knew that they had this virus and they wanted the virus to get sufficiently within the community so that they could then fall back on this plausibility of like, oh, it's a new virus and now we're going to lock down and get some advantage, kind of? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think that... Sorry?
You can continue.
Oh, I was going to say, I think that line of reasoning is valid. I think that makes sense from a certain point of view. It's totally possible that China would release this weapon into the community, and then they would not say anything because they wanted the virus to spread sufficiently so that it would appear like it's a new thing, but also when they shut down, they wouldn't stop the spread. That would be spread far enough out that they could take action, save a lot of their population, but it would be in the world. I think that is absolutely a possibility, and we could see some kind of outbreak like that in the future that would be intentional from China. Where that falls apart for me is back to what the virus is made out of. So while it's possible that China would release a weapon like that, I don't think that this virus fits that bill because of the recombinant aspect and the evidence of it being naturally selected rather than grown in a biolab. The effectiveness, how well those proteins bond to the human cell, that suggests that it was something that occurred naturally and evolved within a human host. If it jumped from the animals as a recombinant, it was already so close, but the infection that's been spreading has mutated slightly so that it is just more efficient. If we were to see a virus made in a lab, there would be pieces of evidence on that virus that would show human manipulation. For example, one of the most effective ways at changing all of these bioweapons is using something like CRISPR, which is a way to edit DNA proteins. But when you do that, you can see little like pieces left behind, like fingerprints, showing where the DNA was messed with. Of course, there's always the possibility that there's... Yeah, sure.
Yeah. So the fact that level 4 facilities exist, the main objective is to destroy the bonds and do it efficiently enough. So at least 95 to 100% efficient. So most of the times, for many outbreaks, you usually do not see any evidence, like fingerprints or anything. In most of the times, like, let me tell you, the second Ebola wave that came in 2018 was generated through a level 4 facility and was much, much weaker. It was in the form of a vaccine so that the body would be acquainted with the basic bonds of the Ebola virus so that in the upcoming years, people are immune and efficient to fight against the virus.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. So in the Ebola outbreak, the second Ebola outbreak, you're referring to the vaccine that was made for that?
They say it was a vaccine, but it was worked on through Hamilton, MT, the bio research facility based in that state, MT. They were the ones who took responsibility that we have weakened the virus enough so that it would potentially do no harm. And then they used the vaccine phenomenon to prove that, okay, it's now possible. So usually...
Oh, I see. They changed... They changed the virus itself.
Yes, whilst leaving it as Ebola. They made it a weaker Ebola.
And it was
for the medical purposes. If you remember clearly, years ago, we used to have the Marburg viruses that are now non-existent. Due to this mechanism used by San Antonio's researchers, they were the ones who got rid of the Marburg viruses in association with the World Health Organization by using the same principle, weakening the disease.
Interesting. I'm actually not familiar with that. So the Marburg viruses, and then they basically create a weaker version of the virus. So that's the virus that gets in the population, and it doesn't kill as many people. Is that correct? So
it has usually killed 2 to 3 people, but then it shouldn't kill more. That's what the objective is. And usually they even have 0 death records. Like, I think the last Ebola outbreak, there was only 1 to 2 deaths in the US, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes.
And I think those all came from people who were working in the area. They weren't
Western
infected.
Africa,
yeah. They didn't get infected here. Okay, so just so I understand correctly, so Hamilton company took a version of the Ebola virus that was very deadly, and they changed the virus's DNA so that it became a less lethal form of the virus, using this principle that by putting that in the community, that virus would not kill as many people, and it would replace the deadly virus. So even if it was endemic, it wouldn't really be a problem. And you're saying that when they did that, there was no evidence in the virus itself that it had been manipulated by humans. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So in then from there, you're saying that because there was no evidence in something like the Ebola virus, it's possible that we could not see the human evidence in the coronavirus that we're facing today.
Yes. Let me add to another virus that was worked on by the Wuhan province. Let me even state the personnel's name. I have some bit of evidence from them.
Yeah.
It was Mr. Y. Zhang and H. Yang. They were responsible for the sensitive detection of the Lassa fever and getting rid of it, because Lassa fever was coming to be another sense of HIV, where it would stay in the body for over 30 years before being excluvent and violent to the body. So it would develop in the body for over 20 to 30 years. That's what the Lassa fever was believed to be, and now Lassa fever is known as one of minor flus after what was worked on.
And so that virus is sort of a similar thing to the Ebola virus, where it was changed?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That's interesting. I didn't know that. And that certainly is possible. I do grant that it's possible that they could have made this virus without any evidence that it was manipulated by humans. Yeah, I think that's a good point. My question then is, why would they release a virus that is not so deadly?
Why would they release a virus that is deadly? They first have to also critically think about their population. Yeah. They were thinking about, okay, we will spread the virus all around the world whilst doing the least damage to our citizens, and they successfully did that. If you look at the world charts, the Wuhan province and the Chinese province as one have less cases than phenomenon countries such as the US, Spain, and Italy. I'm just giving an example.
Yeah.
So in the beginning, they were trying to portray that China was having an issue going against the virus. But now, as we look at it statistically, in the long run, they are barely getting cases 80 to 90 a day, which is...
Yeah, that's quite low. I mean, I don't trust the data coming out of China in terms of their deaths and infection rates. As I said earlier, China has a history of trying to put put the best foot forward for their reputation in the world. And one of the ways they do that is they are deceptive in what they release in their data. They don't tell the full story, or they actually lie about the numbers. So in the coronavirus case, it's hard to have authoritative evidence on this, but there are quite a few personal reports from people saying that more people are dying than the news is reporting. A lot of the citizens have been very unhappy, and there are crematorium workers reporting that they are burning way more bodies than the numbers are saying for how many people died in China. So I think that if the numbers in China are accurate, then China's done a good job. I don't trust the numbers coming out of China being accurate because of their history of lying about things like this in the past. But that's not really relevant to your point. I think your point still stands, even if China is lying about their numbers. Your point is that they would release a weak virus because they didn't want their population to die. Why would the country release the virus in their home rather than traveling to another country with a high densely populated area and releasing the virus there? Perhaps like New York City, why release it in their own population to begin with?
Let me add something to that. 60% of the fish, the bats, and other living organisms that are distributed in the fish market where this COVID-19 started, 50 to 60% is exported all around the world. World-known companies, representatives come, have a look at the quality of the animals, and then decide to export from that one individual or a group of individuals. So they thought of it in a, in a psychological way, that even if we spread it in our country, we will still have people taking those animals with the infection around the world, which will lead to this, as we see today, COVID-19.
As an outbreak. So your theory is that they created the virus in the lab, then they put the virus in the community and inside animal reservoirs, so that the animals would pass the virus and the humans traveling outside would pass the virus.
Yes.
Okay. I could see a point that they would also want their citizens to get infected as a cover, because it would look very suspicious if every country got the virus except China.
That's also another point. And now I want to take you through to the economical side. This could even be linked to the Chinese. Okay, you can go through your point. My point.
Do you mind if before we go to the economic side, we talk about the virus a little bit more?
Yeah.
I think that is a plausible path for this being a bioweapon. But again, I think that most bioweapons, when they're looking to create a dangerous weapon, they look at viruses that are already really, really potent and already really deadly. And then they try to change those viruses. So, for example, back to that Wuhan level 4 facility, the MERS virus was the most deadly coronavirus that we had seen infect humans. And they were working on that virus to make it an aerosol and make it really, really deadly. So we haven't seen cases where they take two viruses and combine them in a lab. We've only seen cases of taking one virus and changing that virus to be something else, to be either less deadly in the case of the Ebola virus, to take it out of the population, or to make it more infectious, like the MERS virus as a weapon. I don't think that it would be plausible that they would go searching for viruses in animal reservoirs where we didn't really know these viruses existed. The pangolin coronavirus is something we only recently discovered. And part of its discovery is because we noticed that there was something different about SARS-CoV-2 that we hadn't seen before in the other coronaviruses. And we were curious about it. So we started looking at other viruses in animal populations in that market. Pangolins being one, bats being another. And we actually don't have all the information about all the coronaviruses out there. There are thousands of coronaviruses in the bats that we haven't even sequenced yet. There's like a long list of them to be looked at. So the idea that they would take a virus that we don't know of yet and then recombine it to make this weapon doesn't seem as plausible. I think your case would be really strong if it was a virus we had already seen and then it had been mutated, like it was another version of MERS or another version of the first SARS. But because there's this strong evidence that it's a recombinant virus and recombined from these two separate animals that we hadn't really thought of as animals for a big outbreak like this, I think that to me suggests that it's more of a natural origin.
Did you look at the diagrams? Because I believe I also read through what you were talking about, the bonds. Did you compare them from the pangolins and the human bonds, and the bat bonds, and the original SARS and MERS? Most of them are common, and the way the bonds are structured, it looks genetically engineered, because you can't bond two viruses to become one lethal weapon, because that would take decades and decades of work. And you can't tell me that the Chinese have been working for it over 60 years, because SARS was non-existent 60 years ago. The first was detected in 1997.
Yeah, I'm not saying that China made it, but I am saying that the virus has been the virus where the animals have been in connection, or they've been in close proximity for that long a period of time. And the virus has evolved in that period of time, rather than it being something that just happened rapidly. I think that these animals have been living in close proximity for a very long time. I mean, I think there was this a long time ago in China, they ran out of food because of the way that the communist government had planned the markets, and there were a lot of droughts and stuff, and there's a ton of food shortages. So one thing that the government did is they encouraged people to eat wild animals. And from that, I believe this started in the 60s or 70s, and from that, they started taking these wild animals and making these markets like the Huanan wet market. So I don't think that the virus evolved in that market itself. I think the virus evolved in one of these things that would bring the animals to the market. And then the wet market just happened to be this reservoir where the virus was present, but it didn't evolve in that market itself. It evolved over a very long period of time. And it's also possible that it jumped to humans and then jumped back to animals and then jumped to humans and jumped back to animals.
But if it jumped back to humans, if it jumped back to humans, your main point would be linking that. Why was it still not detected? Even though it was weak, it would still show symptoms overall.
Not necessarily. Yeah, it would show symptoms, but we don't test every person who gets sick for what type of virus they have, and we don't test every animal for viruses that they have. So in the case of humans, like I'm sure you've had this experience, you go to the doctor and you have like very mild cold symptoms, and they might just say to you like, oh, well, take an antibiotic. Or they might just say, go home, rest. When your fever's gone, go back to work. They don't do an analysis of your blood or to see if you're infected with anything unless it's really, really severe. And whenever, in this virus's case, most people who are dying from this virus are quite old, and they are getting things that old people get with like the flu. So if they come to the hospital and they have pneumonia and all this stuff, they're not necessarily going to test for a new virus just because an old person came in with something like the flu and then ended up dying with symptoms that are very similar to the flu. They're going to just say, okay, this is the flu, and write it off. But if a lot of people, more so than normal, come in and start having these things, then they're going to be like, all right, this is something new. Maybe we should test to see what's happening. Let's do a flu test on all these people and see if we have a new really bad flu. Oh, wait, it's not a flu. Okay, let's test SARS and see if it's like this old virus that popped up in us. No, it's not like that, but it's similar. So there's there are these pathways that go down to us discovering it as a new virus. So if in the human population, when it was infecting a small number of people and jumping back to the animals, and maybe it kills like one person because it's not infectious yet, I think that it is very possible that we wouldn't detect it for a long period of time because it wasn't as effective as it is now. It took the virus becoming really infectious and infecting a lot of people that we hadn't seen before and being deadly to a large number of people, larger than normal, for us to notice, like, wait a minute, we have a new thing.
Let me add something. Average viruses take 20 to 30 years to genetically modify themselves. So what you're trying to say that it took from the original SARS outbreak, you're trying to say that 23 years later, it's come out to be SARS-CoV-2, which coincidentally has bonds from MERS and the genetic flu and the lung deficiency envelope protein destruction. Those features are not possible in this prior length of 23 years. It took at least 50 to 60 years to develop. And you also added the fact, yeah.
That's assuming that it evolved from the first SARS virus, right? My point is that it's a separate virus that evolved on a separate timeline from the first SARS virus. So it existed in the population maybe at the same time the first SARS virus did, but this one was genetically distinct and had its own timeline. So I think it's totally, we don't know exactly when it entered the human population, and we don't know exactly when it recombined with the bats and the pangolins, or when it was living as a reservoir in these animals. But it's very possible that it could have happened 100 years ago in a bat, and then jumped to pangolins 40 years ago, and then has been living in these animal reservoirs for that long and slowly evolving, because this virus does evolve very slowly. As you pointed out, it takes a long time for these changes to happen. So I think that if it were the first SARS virus, I think that'd be a really good point. But I think that this is a distinct timeline. Do you want to go into the economics of it now? Or do you want to keep talking about
I still want to add, now that you started this. I'm just writing down a few names that I've heard about. Yeah. So I'm going to put the years and dates, and I think you can have a sip of water because you're coughing. So
sorry, what did you say?
You can have a sip of water, like.
Oh yeah, sorry.
You're coughing, so.
Thanks.
This is from the level 4 facility. I'm going to name 3 students that have been working with the facility, and then I'm going to tell you the doctor that passed away at the age of 35 who detected the virus on December 12th of 2019.
Yeah.
And was later arrested for 2 weeks for false information. And COVID-19 came out 3 weeks after he predicted it. So first student is Wan Yanling. He was in charge of checking genetical bonds for HIV-1 and MERS-1, as we have had no other MERS outbreak. Second student, named Wang Men, a 2013 graduate student, was working with genetical bonds based around bats in inauguration with Wei Kuiha, who was another master's student who was more experienced in the field of bats and pangolins. They were researching for diseases, and now let me link you to the Dr. Li Wenliang, who died at the age of 34, the doctor that detected the virus on December 12th. He had a good friendly relation with Wan Yanling, and they were discussing that these bats and these MERS bonds in terms of DNA are quite similar, and the other two students are putting a bit more effort than addressed for the virus. 2 weeks later, I'm talking about October beginning. That's when Huan Yanling and Li Wenliang had a communication about these two students putting a lot of emphasis. Now, Wei Xinhua passed away in October. Then, that was the master's student. Then the other student that was in charge of looking at the bats left the workplace. That's the person I was talking about.
May I ask you a
with
question?
the virus. Yeah, that's
the student who passed away, do we know what that student passed away from?
Heart attack.
Okay.
I'm just checking that. Yeah, it's a heart attack. Got a heart attack.
That could be the virus, which we can get into actually. But keep going on.
And then Wang was authorized to go to Atlanta for more emphasis on the virus because they didn't have enough samples of bats. They only had, I think, 4 prototypes of bats in the genomes. So they were going for more emphasis. But since that day, Wang Men has not been seen anywhere, was not reported in Atlanta, and left with the samples and was not more to be seen. Later on December 12th, Li Wenliang, the doctor that predicted the virus, said that there's a virus that's missing from the level 4 facility and seems to be a global pandemic that's upcoming. Be careful of anyone you talk to. Make sure you wear gloves. He gave all the precautions that we give in this present time. He was arrested on December 13th by the National Federation, saying that he spread false information around the world. Then, in early February or January, he passed away. Let me tell you the exact date. That was on Feb 6th. He passed away due to the coronavirus, and the government, what they didn't want, received a lot of criticism for what they did. Yeah.
So this is a timeline showing that the virus was in the lab and then it got out of the lab, basically.
Yes.
And the virus was supposedly made by these two students who were putting a lot of emphasis on the bats, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. I was aware that Lee was arrested and that he said that a pandemic is coming. From what I remember, I thought he just said that we have a novel coronavirus. We discovered a novel coronavirus in my hospital. And from there, he was arrested for spreading false information. He turned out to be right, and then he ended up dying of the virus.
Yeah. And when he was found to be right on February 1st, he got the coronavirus in 2 days after February 1st and passed away. So this was also a motive from the Chinese government to get rid of him so that more evidence would not come out.
Yeah. I see your point. So one thing I was not aware of is that he said that it sounded like you said Lee mentioned that there was a virus in the lab that got released out. Is that what
he
you
didn't?
said?
He didn't mention that. I added that he was in communication with someone within the labs. That was Huan Yanling, who was in charge of MERS-1 and HIV-1.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So then I just want to be clear about what pieces of evidence you're using.
Yes.
The piece of evidence you're using is that he was in communication with someone in the lab, and he was infected with the virus and then died very quickly. And that was done because China did that as like a punishment. Is that correct?
No, they were trying to hide their information, like that they were in charge of this.
So they wanted him dead so that he wouldn't talk about this anymore. And they used the virus to make it look like, I see.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, of course, I can't really like point to any kind of study about that or not, but there's this idea in viruses called viral load. Are you familiar with that?
Viral load? 1 second, let me have a look.
So basically, the idea of a viral load is it's the amount of viruses, like individual virus cells that you come in contact with. If you come in contact with a small amount, of course you can get infected, but the chances are not as high as if you would have come in contact with way more viruses. So the load of viruses that you're exposed to increases the likelihood that you get infected and the severity of the infection, which is why healthcare workers have a much higher rate of getting the virus, and why some of them get really severe cases, even though they might be healthy. Their viral load is much higher than the other part of the population. So as a doctor working with patients who had coronavirus, I could see a case for Lee just having a very high viral load, which is why he died at a young age and died very rapidly, because the viral load he was exposed to was so high. The heart attack that the student had, well, actually, this is kind of not related to the debate topic, so I won't go into that. So this sort of all rests on the idea that we assume that the virus was in the lab and then got out. Because once we make that assumption, then we can see how all of these pieces tie together really well and make a strong argument for your side. So I want to go back to the evidence for the virus being in the lab. You mentioned that there was someone working on bats and pangolins, Wang Ming, right?
Yeah.
So what do you mean when you say genetical bones? Is that looking at the bones of these animals that have died for viruses?
No, genetical bonds means the diseases that are based around the blood systems. So this would mean the amount of anticoagulancy within the body parts and how many diseases and what's their carriage and how they could be spread. Because we saw that the Chinese population highly depended on bats as a source of food, but then boiling them or other forms of frying, like I'm giving examples of cooking preparation methods, were not enough to get rid of the virus.
Right.
Yeah, so they were trying to shortlist that bats would be better off to eat if they had these viruses off the plate. So that was what they were trying to do. But after Wei died, Wang Meng saw this as an opportunity to spread
to spread the virus. Why would Wang Ming want to spread the virus?
Do you think that I want to link you to the economical part? That's why I wanted you to link to the economical part.
I see. Well, I guess I'm not convinced that the virus was made in the lab just yet. I still think that it's a stronger case that the virus arose in the animal agriculture setting because of the recombinant aspect. In the lab, this person working on bats and pangolins, I want to be clear about that. Are the bats and pangolins alive that Wang Ming was working on, or were they dead?
Alive.
They were alive.
Yes.
Okay, so it's very possible that the virus naturally evolved in the lab too, unless the lab hasn't been around for very long, in which case I don't think that's possible.
That's not possible because, wait, let me have a look into that. It was set up in 1989, so been here for long.
Do we know how long they've been looking at bats and penguins?
Since 2003.
2003. It's possible that the virus evolved in that lab, but the only way that would happen is if these animals in that lab were not separated, that they were living in conditions more similar to like animal agriculture, where they're sharing the same air, they're sharing similar food sources, their feces might be shared, that there's a lot of exposure between these two things. And I don't think that
they cannot place them together. They would not be in good relations because they're 4 different prototypes. If you get me, it's like 4 types of human beings cannot be in the same room. They can be in neighboring rooms, but not in the same room because they would not feel comfortable. They would be, because animals also have that evasion of space.
Yeah. I think that's why the animal agriculture case is stronger, because in a farm setting, like, they don't give a shit about that. They're just going to put the animals right beside each other because they're trying to optimize the space that they have available so that they can make profit off of these animals. So they're going to put them in really small cages really close together. But in the lab facility, they're going to be a little bit more controlled so that they can have clean samples of what they're looking at. So I don't think it's likely it evolved naturally in the lab. But that isn't to refute your point that the virus was made in the lab by humans. I think you've mentioned that the virus has 4 prototypes to it, meaning it came from 4 different sources.
Yeah, there were 4 bats that were used for the sampling, and then the Chinese firms were like, okay, we need to completely eradicate this. Okay, the supervisors for Wang were precise that they want to get rid of the virus, so they were going to get more bat samples, and we're going to compare to see the final results as to how many animals have how many bats have the same bonds with diseases.
And they found 4 with the same.
Yeah, right now each bat has 30 to 40% minimum correlation with the SARS-CoV-2.
Yeah, I'm not too familiar with that, but I guess for me, what's more interesting is the DNA sequencing of the virus and the viruses they found in the bats and how similar it was to the human form that we have, and then the pangolin too. In virology, they call that homology. So the homology being high. I could see it theoretically being possible, but I think for this type of virus, because of the way that the two viruses that it has really high similarity to, the outside with the pangolins and the inside with the bat virus, and the conditions necessary for that to recombine is much stronger for me for the animal agriculture case. That's it. That isn't to say it's not possible. It was made in a lab, but I think the evidence is stronger in the case of being made in the animal agriculture. So now you want to link me to Wang Ming and
the Chinese government.
Yeah. Okay, sure. Mm-hmm. We can go into that.
So first, I'm using tradingview.com presently to state what happened. First stock that I'm going to talk about is Berkshire Hathaway INC. It's linked to the New York Stock Exchange, the most expensive stock in the world currently, where one share is worth $292,000 presently as we speak.
That's really high.
Yeah. So during the COVID-19 beginning era, when the American president, Mr. Donald Trump, wasn't taking responsibility and was with the first fact that close all the borders was his main motive.
Mm-hmm.
during that time, we started seeing a downpour of the value of the shares. So before all this COVID-19, the share was constantly at $330,000 to $350,000 per share. And presently, right now, it's finally going up positively to 293,000 and still has 3 hours to close. But I want you to take a specific date. 23rd March was the all-time low. You can even write that down. 23rd
Of
March
2019.
2020.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Yeah.
So what was the 2019 was the value, that high value you listed?
It kept fluctuating around 330 to 345. That was
so
the
March 23rd of this year.
Yes.
Yeah, carry on. Sorry.
March 23rd, 2020. The value of the stock became 230, around 239,000 was its value. It's all-time low. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to write that as $240,000.
Okay.
We're going to go to a second stock. That's the second biggest one in the US. That would be Seaboard Corp Delaware. It's also linked to the New York Stock Exchange. We're going to use the same date. First, we're going to give a usual average. It was averaging at approximately 4,200 to 4,000 during this period. Okay. So that would be SEB.
SEB?
Yeah, and the first one was BRK.A.
Okay.
Okay. March 23rd, 2020. We're going to look at the same date, March 23rd. Let me zoom into that. And the average value we said was approximately 4,000 per share. And it had an all-time low on 20th March, but I'm taking 23rd March because it would be a better comparison to BRKA. Okay. So the value of the SEB on that day was 2,736.68, approximately almost half. It's like 30% to half. Okay. You got that? Okay, now, can someone confirm if you can still hear me? I had a network outflow.
Oh, yeah, I can still hear you. Sorry, I muted myself to type.
Yeah, it's okay, because I had a network fluctuation from my side, so I just wanted to confirm. Now, I'm going to go into Quayshu.co Limited. That would be Chinese SSE stock exchange. They're based around beverages. They had an average share of 6 months ago was 1,000 to 1,500, 1,100 to 1,250 to be precise. So that's China. And I'm going to take the date of March 23rd as well here.
Yeah. Is it possible to type out this information?
I'm writing it down. I can.
Okay. Yeah, maybe you could take a screenshot or something. I'm just having a little trouble following it mentally.
Okay. So
it's just like a lot of dates and numbers, and I'm a little slow in that realm.
Okay, I'll put it into debate chat. I'll just be writing it down. I'm going to start from the beginning. BRK.A equals March 23rd.
And that was 2,400. Sorry, 240,000. All-time low.
$240,000. Then SEB. Everyone who's listening to the debate, you can also check it out through tradingview.com as well. If you want more accurate numbers, I'm just rounding these.
Is there a graph on TradingView.com about this?
Yeah, there's a graph.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'll try and check that out too.
I can link I can link all of them as well. Okay, we were looking at BRK, so I'm just going to link that. Oh, wow.
This is a cool site. I haven't seen it before.
I just also found out about it a few minutes ago as well.
Okay, so then we can see the stock, how low it was and how high it was.
Yeah, yes. And they took March 23rd because it was showing the same data across 2 to 3 platforms.
Mm-hmm.
There, I linked all 3 firms. And if you correlate all the graphs, each tab next to another, you will see from March 23rd, the shares have barely gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And why is it? On February 28th was the last report from China that we received regarding the coronavirus. They said that they've gone into complete lockdown and whatnot.
Yeah.
Yes. So I'm going to refer to BRKA. They have gained their share value of $50,000 per share from the point. So 50,000, yeah. Then we're going to go to SEB. That's the Seaboard Corp, Delaware. They have gone up approximately $400 per share. And whilst we look at the Chinese firm, we have a growth of $100, $100 to $150. But I want you to look at the overall graph for the last 1 year to 5 years.
Of the Chinese one?
Yeah, SSE 600, 519.
That's a lot of. It's rising up quite a bit. There's a little dip in 2019, but it's continually rising.
Yes. Now, even if I take you to other firms all around the world, you're going to see an exponential dip in value, at least 5 to 10%. And the only firm, this is the average of all the firms in China, how the stocks have been. Okay?
The last one, the 600519, that's the average of all Chinese stocks? Okay.
Yeah. So this is just, I saw it as an average because I compared 3 to 4 as well. So if you look at it, SAB, BRK.A, all had drops and they suddenly went back up. That means people reluctantly bought their shares more frequently, and either the government of the country has had a positive response, which it has, which would cause a positive response. Now, it's not an assumption, but I believe the Chinese government observed patterns from Mr. Donald Trump that he was taking a late response for everything. They realized that he will take at least a month or 2 months before he does lockdown announcements or more emphasis into certain states that they would proceed to do a lockdown. So the Chinese government saw this as a way to take ownership over most countries' major corporations. So when they saw that the prices were going down for the shares, they bought loads of shares. I saw from an external source, $200 billion worth of shares were bought for companies all around the world. Multiple billionaire companies' shares were bought on March 23rd. Hence, the Chinese government, in the end, making a profit from this virus.
Yeah.
So, this could be a cooperation of Wang Meng and the Chinese government to make the country get a lot more money outside the service and activities trifecta to get more money just dealing with stocks with a biochemical or a bioweapon.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I absolutely could see China being opportunistic in a time like this. I think this evidence shows that China definitely tried to make the most out of this economic crash around the world. I think historically China tries to do that all the time in all cases. It's always trying to find the best way to make China successful, to increase China's economic power, to increase its power around the world. So if faced with a natural origin virus, I think China would behave exactly the same way that it behaved if faced with something that they made in the lab.
Previous experiences with this, Chinese government maximum would invest at least $40 to $50 million at most. This time they had an all-time high of $200 billion. That's almost 2,000 to 20,000% more than the original.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So that means this high investment and being confident with the return would say that they already knew what was coming. They predicted the patterns.
I think that would be the case if something like this pandemic had happened before in the past. But this is a black swan event. We haven't had a virus spread this fast, this deeply into other countries, and to have this large of an economic impact. We haven't seen something like this in the past. So I don't think that China would be able to predict just how deep the crash was. I think it's more likely that China was just being opportunistic, where they see, wow, this crash has been so crazy. We haven't seen anything like this. So we feel confident that we can invest this amount of money because it's going to bounce back, and it's going to bounce. Usually, based on all recessions in the past, it bounces back higher than it was before. So in this case, it would bounce back like super big. It's super low. So this is the best time to buy a lot. And it wouldn't necessarily need to be planned for them to see that opportunity. They can just use the data that they have on other crashes in the past and compare to how really severe this one was.
I say that this was a planned purchase of $200 billion because the crash was exponentially large because they saw that the governments were not taking responses. Plus, I say that I feel like Wang Meng came in correlation with the Chinese government to plan out and make this buyout for the country. And the Chinese government would do anything for the money, as we have seen before. They've broken trade deals, they've broken rules with and without countries agreeing. And it wouldn't be surprising that they would plan a virus just to make billions of dollars.
Yeah. I think it's a compelling argument. I can totally see China making a bioweapon, releasing the bioweapon, and then trying to make a profit off of the consequences that the bioweapon has in the global economic system. I don't think that is happening in this case. What I think happened in this case, it really lies on how the virus was created. I think that this virus arose in natural origins. And then once the virus had this massive impact on the world, China took it as an opportunity to make themselves look like they're really great at handling viral outbreaks, to invest a bunch of money and make a lot of money on the economic market so that they could become the new economic leader. It doesn't have to be a planned virus for them to want to take that opportunity. And there's a third point, but I can't quite remember what I was going to say. At any rate, it all rests on where the virus origin came from. It's absolutely possible, all the things that you're saying. I think China has intentions to do something like that. And I think we're on the lookout for a virus looking exactly like this. But really, the origin of the virus doesn't suggest that it was man-made, and it doesn't suggest that it was released in this way. I think China was just being opportunistic.
Yeah, I have no more. So I think this way you can call the end unless you want to add anything else.
I don't think so. I guess, yeah. I'm happy to end it there.
Yeah, Stone, you can end it. We can have. Is it a poll based ending or it's a one person decision?
I think it's a poll.
Yeah.
Unless one person concedes.